Okay, looks like we still have some attendees joining us, but we'll go ahead and kick things off. I'd just like to get started by thanking everybody for joining our webinar today. Hope everyone is doing well, and we sincerely appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Please do take this opportunity to ask our panelists any questions you have on the updates we're going to go through today. As I mentioned earlier, you can utilize the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can throughout the webinar. If we don't get to your question, we will be sure to follow up with you afterwards. And for anyone who's new joining us, this is the third webinar we're doing as part of our ongoing Navigating the COVID-19 Pandemic series, where we convene our local marketing experts to provide the most up-to-date and actionable information that multi-location brands can use and implement right now. If you've joined us before, then welcome back. And if you've missed the first or second part in this series, you can find the recording on demand on our website at rioseo.com/COVID-19, where we also have a bunch of other resources that you can utilize during this time. Just a few additional housekeeping items before we go ahead and dive in. Everyone will be on mute throughout the webinar. However, as I mentioned, please do utilize Q&A throughout the webinar to share any questions you have. And feel free to send us any additional questions via email. You can send those to marketing@rioseo.com after the webinar, or reach out to us through Twitter or social media. And finally, we are recording the webinar today, and we'll be sending the link within the next 24 hours, so please look out for a follow-up email from us after the webinar. Now, before we go ahead and jump into the content, let me just quickly introduce myself and our panelists today. My name is Justin Gianninoto, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Rio SEO, and I'm going to be moderating your webinar today. And I'm very fortunate to be joined again by two of my colleagues, Krystal Taing, who is our Director of Local Strategy and a Google My Business Gold Product Expert, and Ryan Weber, who is our Director of Client Success at Rio SEO. Welcome to you both. Thank you again so much for joining us. And before we go ahead and dive in, just thought we'd kick off with questions, see how you guys are holding up. What are you guys watching anything on Netflix, binging any interesting series right now?
I am actually this is Krystal, I'm on the spectrum where I'm either binging and rewatching the entire series of Schitt's Creek, or just head down in a murder mystery or true murder doc. So any ends of those spectrums is where I'm spending my time.
Yeah, for me, I think like most of the country, I was totally absorbed with Tiger King for a little bit there, like a train wreck you couldn't look away from. But as far as quality programming, I think Ozark is one I can't recommend highly enough. The third season just came out not long ago. That's one worth checking out if you haven't already.
Ozark is fantastic. If anyone has any additional recommendations, feel free to shoot those over to us in the messaging panel as well. We can go ahead and jump into the agenda today. As I mentioned, on these webinars, we are talking through the most recent updates to GMB and third-party platforms. I already introduced myself and today's panelists, so let's go ahead and dive into the updates we're going to cover today. We're going to talk through some of the latest from Google on reviews and review response. There have been a lot of changes there recently. We've covered this in our previous webinars as well, and seems to change on a weekly basis at this point. So we'll continue the dialogue on reputation management. We're going to talk through some new GMB links that are available and rolling out now for healthcare and medical professionals. Then we'll dive into some structured data, special announcement structured data for COVID-related content that was recently released. There are some additional dining, shopping, and healthcare attributes in GMB as well that we'll talk through. And then a little bit on Facebook hours and services updates, touching on some recent updates from Facebook. And then finally, how publishers are handling COVID-19 testing sites. So once again, if there's anything that's not on this list that you'd like us to talk through, we're happy to answer any questions you have throughout the webinar. But we'll go ahead and kick things off with reviews. Definitely, as I mentioned, a topic that's been a little bit of a moving target for local marketers over the past few weeks. Definitely when it comes to GMB. And as I mentioned during our last webinar, we touched on Google's temporary suspension of reviews and review response and Q&A. After a brief hiatus, Google has since confirmed that review responses are being published once again. And we're also beginning to see new reviews gradually publish, which Google has said will happen over the next few weeks. So We'll start with you, Ryan, and maybe just if you can discuss, given some of these most recent changes and some of the changes that may still be forthcoming, what should brands be thinking about right now with respect to their reputation management strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So, I mean, like you said, new reviews are starting to get published again, specifically for food and shopping categories, basically covering, the essential businesses, right, that are still operating. And the expectation is that this will continue to gradually roll out to other categories as well in the coming weeks. As far as how this impacts strategy, I mean, I think that the most important thing, more important now than ever, is to be transparent. Right? I think consumers understand that there are impacts to local businesses, right, as a result of COVID. And so if there are, delays in service or limited stock or inventory, due to staffing changes or supply chain restrictions, communicate that, right? Share with consumers in an engaging way, sort of the challenges that, again, I think they're going to be more willing to understand at this point than ever before. Also, I'd say, if you're doing anything to give back or to support the local community or healthcare workers, that's worth calling out, right? It's worth flagging in these dialogues that you're having in GMB.
Excellent. And Krystal, anything to add there as far as what you're seeing? Are there any industries that are rolling out more quickly than others, or any insight you can share on the rollout process for reviews coming back online?
Yeah, as Ryan mentioned, right now, all food and shopping industries are now receiving new reviews. So new reviews that are coming in and being left by consumers today. But the backloading of reviews that were turned off during that period still haven't been addressed. So I think that's what we'll still look for Google to roll out, as well as other industries. I think the one that they'll likely be focused on and probably more critical of is going to be, any of those brands in the healthcare industry. They're going to be, really cautious about the types of reviews that were left over the last 2 to 4 weeks there. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's the last industry to roll out, or those, guidelines are delayed a little bit there for healthcare.
Absolutely. So definitely, as I said, something that's been a little bit of a moving target, but something that we'll continue to keep an eye on and share updates on as things roll out over the next week or so. Staying on the topic of GMB and healthcare specifically, for health and medical professionals, Google has recently introduced a couple of new links in GMB as of last week. And these are part of, I think, Google's larger effort to make healthcare information a little bit more accessible and to help expedite the delivery of that information. So Krystal, can you discuss what these links are and how healthcare brands, when they can expect to see them, and any recommendations you can offer for how healthcare brands should be utilizing them?
Yeah, so the most recent links that they're allowing healthcare professionals and facilities to add to their profiles include a link that shares updates and information about COVID-19. And that is right now the only link that's displaying, and it's only displaying on mobile search. So a lot of these features are really new. Google's still working through display and backend and front end capabilities. So note that a lot of these will still change, and what it looks like today may not be what it looks like in the next few weeks. But they're really trying to get something out there and get it going, and then they'll potentially expand these things. The other links of information that they're gathering that aren't displaying yet are links to telehealth as well as virtual visits. And then there's also a new attribute for virtual visit that displays on mobile, which just tells consumers whether or not you allow virtual visits. But including those links now, so that as the front end display is published and rolled out on GMB, is going to be critical. And I think these are trends that we'll see long term for Google. So it'll be great for brands that don't necessarily have telehealth or virtual visits today to consider adding these, because as consumers see these capabilities on search and on GMB profiles, I think they're going to begin to expect it more and more.
Yeah, and one note, sorry, Justin, one note on the COVID-19 info link. We've seen a few cases where Google has actually proactively going out and grabbing what they think to be your brand's authoritative page on COVID-19. So if you haven't, loaded a URL there on your own, it might be worth just double checking your account to see if Google might have populated something for you. And if so, to make sure that's the best link that you do want customers to see on the profile there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good additional point. A lot of times Google has been implementing some of these changes on the back end, so definitely good reminder for most businesses to go and verify that information is correct. Staying on sort of the topic of attributes, Krystal, you mentioned, a few new attributes for healthcare. In our last webinar, we also covered some new attributes for restaurant brands. And Google recently added several new attributes for dining, shopping, and healthcare. Some of those include curbside pickup, no contact delivery, and you mentioned telehealth. Maybe Ryan, can you further explain some of these new attributes, how they work? Are they similar to the restaurant attributes that we talked through last time? And how can businesses in those verticals start leveraging those?
Yeah, absolutely. So they are very similar to what we talked about on the restaurant side. I mean, in addition to, the attributes that have always been available for restaurants like delivery, takeout, or dine-in, you've got two new options now, one for curbside pickup and then one for no contact delivery. In addition to the restaurant vertical, you also have for retail, has curbside pickup, delivery, and pickup are now available for retail as well. And then for healthcare, we kind of talked through these, the COVID URL, whether or not video visits are available, and then the actual URL for telehealth. We're just seeing in the last 48 hours, the retail attributes start to roll out on the front end. Target is a good example of this. If you're to do a search, you'll see that there's basically a green check mark, just like we've seen for the restaurant vertical, showing that both delivery and pickup are available. These attributes can be updated directly in the GMB UI. You could do a bulk upload. You could also update this through the API. And if you're not offering one of these services and you submit that attribute, you're going to get the red X. Again, the UI is almost identical to what we're seeing, or what we've been seeing for the last week or so in the restaurant vertical.
And one thing I would just add to that about attributes in general, I think this is a great time if you had previously ignored or overlooked some of the attributes in GMB, just like even long-standing ones such as appointment URL or what type of offerings you have. I think this is a great time to just take a look and evaluate and update all of them across all your locations, because Google is beginning to service these more visibly to a lot of consumers, especially if they're really relevant right now.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, we've talked a lot about some of these verticals, dining, shopping, healthcare. Obviously, there's been a ton of change within those verticals, but there are many other businesses that have information to communicate, whether it's from government, health organizations, schools, et cetera. There are really a lot of different verticals that this touches. And sometimes, going beyond GMB, it's important to make sure that you're communicating that information on your local landing pages as well, and on your website. Basically, this can include, if you're closing your facilities temporarily, or if you're rescheduling events. I touched on this earlier. How can brands, maybe we'll start with you on this one, Ryan, how can brands implement some of these announcements on their web pages using the new structured data that Google recently announced?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's pretty straightforward, right? It's a new type of schema markup for a quote unquote special announcement. It came out maybe 2-3 weeks ago, but in the last week or so, Google actually formally published how they plan to leverage that structured data. And initially, they're focusing really on healthcare, which makes sense. Healthcare and government organizations. I think in the next weeks or months, we'll start to see that roll out to other verticals as well. But in the meantime, it's a pretty straightforward update. You can get the JSON code for this from the schema.org site. And again, it's just a special announcement schema that you can mark up text on your page to tell Google this is a COVID-related announcement, and it's something that we want to be surfaced in the SERP.
Absolutely. And, thinking about other channels for brands to communicate these types of announcements, obviously app usage is something that we're keeping an eye on and something that has dramatically increased. For example, in Italy, app usage has grown 30% in March, while France, Germany, and the US have all had smaller but similarly large increases, I think 15, 10, and 10% growth respectively over the last month. And many brands now are leveraging social networks to communicate hours and services updates, given this staggering increase in app usage. So we'll stick with you, Ryan. How can businesses communicate hours and services updates on Facebook? I know that they recently released some features to allow brands to better communicate some of this information. Any recommendations that you can share there?
Sure. Yeah. So it's fairly similar to what Google has done with the attribute updates. You have basically two new fields two new field and value pairs in the Facebook API. These can also be updated directly in the Facebook UI and through bulk uploads as well. But the first one is temporary status, right? So if you're temporarily closed, you can now indicate that on your Facebook profile. The other options are either operating as usual, so no change, and then differently open, so meaning you're still operating but in some kind of altered capacity, right? So perfect example there is restaurants that are still open but they're closed for dine-in, right? And then if you are operating differently than normal, there's a few options that you can publish to consumers that'll actually show up in the hours section of your profile. Either you're still offering online services, you're offering delivery, or you're offering pickup, and then there's an other as well. And I think Facebook, is encouraging brands to couple these more scalable updates with posts as well that go into more detail, right, about the types of services that are available. For example, if it's going to be curbside pickup versus in-store pickup, they're kind of relying on the brand to communicate that through an actual Facebook post in addition to these attributes or statuses via the API.
Right, and obviously there are many different platforms to be aware of, and many platforms have implemented similar changes here. Obviously, we've spent a lot of time touching on GMB with the many updates over the past few weeks there, Facebook as well. And switching gears just a little bit, again, Apple Maps. Apple has recently announced that it's working to display coronavirus testing locations, launching a portal on its website for medical facilities to register as coronavirus screening locations. So Krystal, going back to you, maybe you can share a little bit about what Apple has done here and how other publishers similarly are handling some of these COVID testing sites.
Yeah, of course. So I think based on the information, I've received from a number of different publishers, is most, Apple, Google, Bing, Foursquare, Yelp, they're looking for brands to gather some kind of initial data, but they're not taking that as source of truth. They're taking that and then, leveraging a lot of, health organization data in terms of publishing this. And they're being very cautious with this and almost kind of taking an opt-in approach where they're waiting for the states and municipalities to say, yes, we want to surface this testing site data on Google for, this state or this city or this region. Because there's certainly a lot that, don't want to surface this information. Typically the kind of, harder hit states and cities are going to be a little bit more cautious about how they're publishing this on surface to consumers. And I think with reason, the last thing, Google or Apple would want to do is publish this data, and then these testing sites just get overloaded with a lot of sick people. So, they've been a little bit slower to roll this out, but with reason. But from, my conversations with a lot of these sites, they're gathering this information from brands today and beginning to surface it. And I think even just, in the last day, we've seen Google Maps now surface a specific query just for coronavirus testing centers. So that's new within, the last few hours, and it'll continue to expand. And, I would assume that it's going to be adjusted over the next few weeks as we see how this rolls out.
Mhm. And, as I mentioned, obviously, a lot of these platforms are making and implementing similar changes. I guess, I'll open this up to either of you. Are we noticing anything different on Bing? We touched on Apple Maps, a little bit on Facebook. We talked obviously quite a bit about GMB. Has there been any other interesting or different updates with Bing or any other platforms that some of the folks should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I can, I'll let Krystal add color here, but we know that Bing is also starting to adopt listings for COVID test sites, right? And in a similar vein as the others, as Krystal mentioned, I think the publishers want to be cautious that they're doing this in the right way, right? A lot of times, actually, in all cases, there's a fairly comprehensive screening process that patients need to go through before they can actually get a test. And to Krystal's point, the last thing the states and local governments that are managing these test sites want is to be overrun. So there's definitely a lot of caution and sensitivity in how they're being rolled out. But Bing is another one that we know is sort of throwing their hat in the ring and saying, we do want to help, we want to surface these testing locations, but they just want to be, I guess, smart about how they do it and how they roll it out.
Absolutely. And coming up on the end of our time here, I'm just going to put up some of these additional resources on the screen here, and we'll handle just maybe one or two more questions before we wrap up today. Do you have any additional recommendations? We covered, as I said, a number of platforms, majority of GMB updates. Any additional recommendations for how businesses should be considering their Yelp presence? I know there were some updates to their review guidelines a few weeks ago. Have we seen anything recently with Yelp that brands should be aware of here, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it there. Yelp has put in definitely some more stringent content guidelines around reviews. So anything that's referring to reports of someone contracting COVID at a local business, that's going to be filtered out. Any comments related to COVID are being filtered out at this point. Things you can do though. Yelp also has the ability for you to mark your location as temporarily closed. You could take advantage of that, or if hours are adjusted, you could certainly take advantage of that as well. And then, the ability to post updates from the business, depending on what your relationship is with Yelp. If you've got branded or enhanced profiles versus just a standard listing, there's some new things that are being rolled out there from a brand communication standpoint that we're keeping a close eye on as well. So something to be aware of and keep an eye on.
Great, thank you. Just want to take one more question before we wrap up. Somebody wrote in that they're having an issue verifying a business location with GMB because it's marked as temporarily closed. Any recommendations you can offer there, Krystal? I'm not sure if this is a common issue that we've seen with other clients trying to verify new locations.
Yeah, unfortunately here, if you're not in the healthcare industry, to Google, this is working as intended. They've shifted a lot of their resources. But I will say that, in the next few weeks, we should see them be able to, address some of these lagging issues, whether it's, business edits. Verification has really been a huge issue. People that hadn't previously claimed their listings. Unfortunately, when all this rolled out, that's one of the things Google stopped doing is, helping with verifications for non-healthcare industries. So in this case, yeah, if you're not a healthcare industry, that's, going to be delayed. You can always try suggesting an edit, trying to get some other people internally to suggest an edit on maps if you need to change any of the data. That's still being reviewed by the maps team. But that is, right now your best bet, but, crossing fingers in the next, few weeks, we'll see this pick up in terms of support from GMB.
Absolutely. Yeah, it seems like a lot of that support is gradually beginning to come back online. So that's definitely good to see, and we'll continue to keep an eye on that over the next few weeks and share any relevant updates with you all there. I think that's about all the time that we have for today, but if you did ask any questions or any questions come to mind that you weren't able to ask throughout the webinar, we'd be happy to follow up with you afterwards. As I mentioned, please send us an email to marketing@rioseo.com. We're happy to get back to you. I want to thank our panelists so much. Krystal and Ryan, thank you for sharing your insight and joining us again today. And thank you everybody for joining today's discussion and contributing your questions. Please keep an eye on our website. These and other resources are being constantly updated. As I said, feel free to reach out with any questions you have, or if there's any additional support we can provide, we are always happy to help. Please stay safe and healthy out there, everyone, and we look forward to connecting with you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks all for joining us.